For this video, we're going to be looking at what would happen if Courtney and Blaineley, who were both originally eliminated in this episode, actually had an official tiebreaker and Chris didn't get rid of both of them. I think it's pretty fair to say that Courtney would beat Blaineley in just about anything. She's shown to be really aggressive, really agile, really strong, really quick, really smart, and Blaineley, I don't know, doesn't really seem all that impressive. But since this what if video is going to be like 6, 7 episodes, I decided it'd be more interesting to go through both universes of what would happen if Courtney won the tiebreaker and what if Blaineley won the tiebreaker. So if you check the timestamps in the description and in the video, the first one's going to be what if Courtney won, and then there's going to be one way later in the video about what if Blaineley won. For this to happen, the episode would not have to be a double elimination, and the only reason it was a double elimination is because Chris had problems with production calling him about money and cost. So in this world, that wouldn't happen. Production would never call him. He actually talked a lot during the challenges where he's consistently getting interrupted by the producers calling, which was messing up the challenge, and that wouldn't happen. However, going through didn't really change that much. I can just quickly say what would happen. During the first challenge where everybody has to race to the end, Chris would just be able to tell them that there's no reward for going first, and it's just whoever crosses is a part of the challenge. And also that you don't have to take a form of transportation, so Heather wouldn't take the painful shoes that hurt her feet. When it came to this beginning part, Alejandro and Duncan were originally in front, and Courtney got blown up at some point, and Alejandro considered going back for her because they're an alliance and he wants to work with her, but he originally opted not to do that because he wanted to be first. So I considered if he would actually go out of his way to help Courtney now, since he knows that there's no reward for being first, he just needs to cross the line. But if you look at the clip, Courtney gets launched, and I mean launched far. She almost hits Chris, who's up in a helicopter. Like, I don't know how Alejandro would possibly help her. So I'm assuming Alejandro would probably just still leave her, since there's not much you can really do at that point. And honestly, that's about it. I mean, Chris would probably notice Blaineley or Alejandro's cheating, but it doesn't really matter because, you know, they get caught anyway, and the same thing still happens with Heather calling them out, so not really much of note. This first one, we're assuming Courtney won. Blaineley gets eliminated this episode, and now we're at the final 6. Since Blaineley gets eliminated, she still says the same thing she says in the original about Zeke being on the plane and acknowledges Alejandro and Heather's tension, so those things still get mentioned. When it comes to the very beginning of this challenge, Chris would still find out that Chef helped Blaineley cheat, and it's not really clear how he figured this out. I rewatched the Chinese fake out, I rewatched this episode. There was no point in either of those episodes where he officially got evidence or anything. It was just like a time difference between the last episode and this one. There was some point in there where he had figured out that Chef helped Blaineley cheat. That would still happen, and Chef would still be punished with wearing the heavy winter suit in Africa. Duncan is actually originally kind of happy in this episode because Courtney is gone, but now that Courtney is very much still here, he's still kind of on edge. And because Sierra won the last challenge, she took Cody to first class, so these 4 are in LoserCon, so Courtney and Duncan are still fighting. And then when Alejandro pokes fun at their fighting, Duncan comments on him and Alejandro, which is what Blaineley was alluding to about them being lovebirds, and they're both denying it. Since Courtney is still here, and Courtney actually is shown to have a crush on Alejandro during this season because he's Alejandro, she would get upset at this, and she had already mentioned before that her plan was to get Heather out first because she was really annoyed that Heather was getting attention from Alejandro, so that plan would just be more enforced in her now, since that's still happening. When it comes to the actual challenge, I imagine everything kind of plays out the same. Heather would probably still get first. Alejandro would still be able to break his gourd. Duncan would break his gourd by cheating. Sierra and Cody would both not be able to break it. When it comes to Courtney, I feel she's pretty good at challenges, so there's no reason I can think that she wouldn't do all of this. So I imagine she'd probably do the same as Alejandro. She'd break her gourd properly, and she'd get free balls and a slingshot. When it comes to the actual hunting part of the challenge, Alejandro would still want to work with Duncan. He'd still take Heather into a huddle and steal all her trank balls. Now that Courtney is here and Courtney likes Alejandro, Courtney would probably also want to come. And Alejandro and Duncan have been working together to work Courtney to get them on her side. So Duncan would allow it since, you know, it's part of their alliance to all work together. However, since Courtney and Duncan are fighting a lot, Alejandro gets annoyed with them pretty quickly because they're just kind of bickering all the time, and Alejandro wants to focus on the challenge. And while they are all fighting, they realize they stand in quicksand and that they fall in, because that's originally what happens to Alejandro and Duncan, and I don't imagine Courtney being there would change anything. I also imagine they'd probably get out the same way with Ezekiel being by, so it doesn't really matter too much, but it just shows how dysfunctional the group is. Everything with Sierra, Cody, and Heather would kind of play out the same. Sierra would get Cody stuck up in a tree, Heather would find a lion and then run away from the lion and then run into Sierra, and Sierra and Heather would go out, and the same things with everyone shooting each other with trank balls, these two teams meeting up and shooting each other with trank balls happens. When they get back up, Alejandro and Heather would still make an alliance like they do originally to work at the end. And Alejandro realizing at this point that Courtney and Duncan's bickering really is kind of becoming more of a liability to him, since he doesn't need both of them, because having both of them kind of hurts him. Because if he was working with only one of them, they would be happy just working with him. But like, it's not very useful to have an ally who's constantly only focused on, getting payback on somebody. So in Alejandro's mind, it makes sense to get rid of one of them. And I think that person would be Duncan, because Courtney has shown to be completely infatuated with him, so it wouldn't really make sense for Alejandro to get rid of her. This means that Alejandro would still do the same plan he did originally, would do the same plan he did with Heather. He'd trip Duncan into a berry bush that has the berries that smell like blood. Ezekiel would attack Duncan, and then Alejandro would shoot Zeke and Duncan to get the win. When it comes to the vote, it's pretty obvious that Courtney's been pitching to get rid of Heather, and she really doesn't like Heather because of how much attention she's getting from Alejandro. She would talk to Alejandro and try to convince him to vote for Heather. Alejandro is really good at manipulating people, and he would be able to manipulate her into voting Duncan by saying things like he can't handle the way that he disrespects her and he wants him gone as quickly as possible. And Courtney, being a total simp for Alejandro, would just go along with that. But for every other vote, it is really difficult for me to find out what happens. And that's mainly because looking at the original, it is already confusing where the votes go, because there are so many things happening. For one reason especially is that Alejandro got a vote in the original, and he won immunity. So somebody voted for him knowing it wouldn't count. It's like, who would do that? I did a lot of research trying to figure out where the votes went, and I was confused for a while. Doing very extensive research to the most knowledgeable place on the planet, r/total drama. It seemed like a pretty general consensus that Alejandro and Heather voted together to vote for Duncan, Cody voted Sierra, Sierra voted Heather, and Duncan voted Alejandro. So with that knowledge, it's fair to say that Heather and Alejandro are kind of working together for this vote. So Alejandro would gladly tell Heather about the plan, but Heather is really smart, and she would realize that keeping Courtney, who's targeting her, is a bad move. And she also obviously knows that Alejandro is an amazing challenge competitor, so he wouldn't want Alejandro to have a strong ally. So instead, Heather would target Courtney. And obviously she could sway Duncan pretty easily to vote for Courtney since they don't like each other, so that's an easy vote. And I do think she could also get Cody, because Cody and Heather kind of have a weird dynamic where they're not best friends or anything like that, but they have definitely shown semblance of them being friends, and Cody even says in the finale, overall Heather hasn't been that bad to me. So Heather could probably make a deal with Cody, like, if you vote out Courtney for me this round, I'll vote out Sierra for you next round. And then Cody would obviously go along with that since Sierra's situation is getting pretty crazy. and Cody would definitely see that because she poisoned him with tea and made him sick and then carried around his body. I don't really want to talk about this. It's a messed up thing on its own. But obviously Cody would want Sierra gone, and Cody would be fine with getting rid of Courtney for this episode if it means he could get rid of Sierra the next. So the vote would be a 3-2 to 1, with 3 votes on Courtney here, 2 votes on Duncan, and then Sierra voting Heather, I guess, because she voted Heather originally. And Alejandro winning this challenge would have to decide who he's going to take to first class with him. And originally he takes Cody to start working on him, like as an alliance, but considering Cody just voted against him, he wouldn't want to take Cody anymore. And since Sierra was the only one left out of the vote, he'd take Sierra to start working on an alliance with her. Now in the next episode, I imagine that since Alejandro and Sierra are together in first class, and he needs Sierra on his side desperately, because he has no allies at this point, so he needs Sierra on his side, I think he would push like the plan he had in Drumheller just 1 episode early. He edited a photo of Heather and Cody snuggling together and then showed it to Sierra, and Sierra got really mad and basically wanted to kill Heather. So I imagine he'd do that with Sierra now, just an episode early, which again inspires Sierra to be extremely jealous and angry at Heather. Heather, Duncan, and Cody are all in loser class talking about who they should vote out next. Duncan is pitching heavy for Alejandro to go since he's still mad at Alejandro for turning him to Zeke food. But Cody's insistent on Sierra going since the situation's getting really out of hand, and Heather made a deal with him that she would go this episode. Heather is actually a bit undecided at this point, because even though she hates Alejandro, she would realize that if Alejandro were to go, that she would become the biggest threat in the game. That wouldn't be good for her. Also, she has a little crush on Alejandro, and she probably wouldn't actually want him to go so early, because we saw, like, even in this episode, when she thought that Alejandro might go, she got sad. So there's reasons to get rid of Alejandro, and there's reasons to not in Heather's mind. So it's kind of up in the air for her. Duncan gets annoyed at this since he obviously kind of sees it as Heather just not wanting to get rid of Alejandro because she has a crush on him. And Duncan is not in the best terms of Heather anyway because Heather was still part of the plan to turn him into Siegfried. Like, she was still there when it happened and she didn't do anything that much. But he's okay with her for now since she saved him last round, but he obviously isn't forgetting that. Alejandro originally has the candy basket that he gives to Cody, and I think he'd still do that since he's still trying to get good faith with Cody, and that would get him good faith with Sierra as well since Sierra likes Cody, so she'd be happy if Alejandro was helping him out. Cody would be a bit hesitant for this since not part of Alejandro's alliance and he doesn't really trust Alejandro. But we saw in the original that Cody went crazy when Candy was in the situation. It was basically like drugs to him. So I imagine he'd still take the food and he'd still appreciate the gesture, but he wouldn't get too on Alejandro's side or anything. He just really likes Candy. With Sierra being really mad at Heather, she's also kind of upset at Cody since she also kind of thinks, he was cheating on her. Even though they're not dating, it's just she's upset that Cody would, snuggle with Heather. And Cody doesn't really know why Sierra is being so standoffish with him. But because he doesn't know, and Sierra's been acting so crazy, this definitely worries Cody more than he already has been. So those red flags are still kind of blaring in his face. Now, Cody would have the basket that Alejandro gave him. Alejandro can juggle, and Sierra can weave baskets. And even if Alejandro needed to stop juggling, Sierra could just make him a basket. But since Sierra is against Heather, and in turn also against Duncan, I don't see Sierra making a basket for either of them. And I don't really see a way in which Heather or Duncan could get to the end of the race quicker without a basket. So in my mind, for the first part of the challenge, they are just kind of out of it. And the groups are traveling together in the way they are right now. Alejandro, Sierra, and Cody would travel together, and Heather and Duncan would travel together. With Duncan still constantly trying to put in Heather's mind that they should get rid of Alejandro instead of Sierra. When Sierra's egg hatches and makes a bird baby, Heather is originally there, and when the bird hatches, it imprints on Heather. But since Heather's with Duncan now, it wouldn't be Heather there to imprint on. So now it's kind of a question of who would it imprint on, Alejandro or Cody? And it's kind of difficult to tell since they're all there, and I can't tell who would be holding the egg, who would be looking at the egg. Considering that Sierra was really creepy and obsessed with having all of her and Cody's eggs in the same basket that Cody was holding, I'd imagine she'd put her eggs in Cody's basket, and then the bird would hatch inside Cody's basket, which leads me to believe that it would probably see Cody first since it's in his basket. So the bird would imprint on Cody, which is pretty important because I don't even think it really matters who wins the first part of the challenge, because as we saw in the original, the mask didn't really help that much. I'd assume Alejandro would probably win it again. It doesn't matter because since the baby bird imprinted on Cody, when Cody goes to climb up to the condor nest, the bird would land on his head, and akin to how Heather won the challenge originally, the big mama condor would come and snatch the baby, giving Cody time to put the eggs, meaning Cody would win immunity for this challenge. It's hard to tell if Cody would find out about Sierra being upset because of the photo. In Drumheller, when it happens, Cody is following Sierra and trying to fix her with Sierra because he thinks that Sierra's mad at him for voting her. But now that Cody didn't vote her, Cody doesn't really know why Sierra's mad at him. Cody isn't following her, trying to get her approval, and again, she's been really creepy, so Cody would be pretty scared. But even by the off chance that they would talk about it, Cody's defense to it was that him and Heather have never been alone at a point where Sierra wasn't there. But that actually wouldn't work this time, because in the beginning of this episode, Sierra and Alejandro were in first class, and Cody and Heather Duncan were in loser class. And, I mean, it is possible that Sierra snuck into loser class because she's crazy, but considering that Alejandro got the photo, and obviously Sierra still has to sleep at a certain point, there would be a time where Cody and Heather would have been apart, so that plea wouldn't even work on her, even if that was brought up, which I already think is low. So Cody wouldn't figure out at this point that's why Sierra's mad at him, and he also wouldn't figure out that Alejandro had anything to do with this, since Sierra obviously wouldn't tell him. And considering just how crazy Sierra's been in this episode, and her really bad treatment to Heather because she thinks that Heather is trying to steal Cody with the photo evidence, Heather at this point would be swayed enough to vote for Sierra. Cody would obviously want to vote for Sierra. And even though Duncan's a bit reluctant about voting for Sierra since he wanted Alejandro gone, he'd see that Heather and Cody already did it, so he'd just follow along with the vote and give it to Sierra. Since obviously he wouldn't be too upset about that since Sierra's shown to be a really strong competitor, so it's not really the biggest loss to him. Now that Cody won this challenge, I imagine that he would take Heather to first class since, the other options are the person they're all against or the person who he very much does not like at all. because of the entire Gwen situation. And Heather's been generally good to him, so he'd take Heather to first class. Next episode, Cody and Heather together in first class would make an agreement to go to the finale together. Since obviously that kind of benefits both of them, since Cody would want to go to the finale, and Heather would obviously want to go to the finale of Cody over Duncan and Alejandro, since they are both much better competitors. Alejandro decides that while he's in loser class with Duncan, that he could try to work on making a somewhat of an alliance with him. Duncan's obviously pretty against hearing this since he's still mad at Alejandro, but still decides to hear him out since it could be a good offer. So Alejandro starts his deal making by telling Duncan that if he were to go, like if he was to follow along with Heather and Cody's plan to get rid of him this episode, then he would be in the final three with two people who are probably much closer to each other and want to go to the end with each other a lot more than they want to go to the end with him. And Duncan agrees with this, and Alejandro makes a deal with Duncan that if he votes with him this round, then he will take him to the finale if he wins the final three. And Duncan considers the offer heavily since that is kind of his best shots to get to the end. When it comes to the challenge, obviously Heather, Cody, and Alejandro would make the same dinosaur, and I imagine Duncan would probably just make some messed up, twisted dinosaur, a bunch of skulls and stuff. It's real edgy, like him. Then when it comes to the votings, each contestant is put to a lie detector and has to give an honest answer of what they think is the best dinosaur from the other competitors. So Alejandro wouldn't lean towards Heather's because he hates Chris, and obviously Cody's is a shit dinosaur. So he by default would kind of lean towards Duncan, thinking that, his art is interpretive, being the nicest thing you could say about it. I don't think Heather would really appeal to Duncan's, kind of messy design, and obviously she couldn't honestly vote for Cody's shit dinosaur. So I do think she'd be somewhat impressed with Alejandro's ability to make a real dinosaur, and would have to admit it. Cody, same sort of idea. I don't think he'd really like Duncan's style, and he hates Chris. And it was shown in the original that when Alejandro revealed it was a real dinosaur, Cody was pretty impressed, so I do think Cody would lean towards Alejandro's. And then when it comes to Duncan, obviously he wouldn't like Chris, and he wouldn't really care for like a real dinosaur. But I do think Duncan would think it's so funny that Cody unintentionally made such a terrible dinosaur that he would genuinely think Cody's the best just because of the laugh it gave him. This means that Alejandro got 2 votes, Cody got 1 vote, and Duncan got 1 vote. And Heather got no votes. This means that for the next part of the challenge where they have to dig up an oil barrel, Alejandro would get the drill, Cody and Duncan would get a pickaxe, and Heather would get nothing. Alejandro already proved to be pretty good at this challenge when he was just using his hands, but now that he has a drill, I imagine he could pretty handily win this challenge. But there are still some things to notice with this challenge. Heather would probably still get caved in by the rock since she'd probably still dig in the same area, and she doesn't really need a pickaxe to dig the way she did. It was seen by Alejandro, he was able to make a considerable hole with just his hands. So Heather could do the same, and she'd still get trapped in by the boulder. But now that Alejandro's at the plane since he won, Alejandro wouldn't find Heather. And this time Duncan would find Heather. And Duncan makes a deal saying he will help Heather out of the hole. And Duncan makes a deal with Heather saying he will help her out of the hole if Heather promises to take him to the finale. Since Heather's pinned under the rock, she would agree to Duncan's agreement, but she would have her fingers crossed while her hands are covered by the rock. And then when it comes to the actual vote, Duncan has made deals with both Alejandro and Heather about going to the end. So it's pretty obvious that Duncan would vote Cody. And Cody working with Heather and not being able to vote Alejandro because he won immunity would lean Duncan, so they'd vote each other. Alejandro also made a deal with Duncan about going to the end, so that means he would also lean Cody. And then Heather crossing the deal, not actually making the deal with Duncan, would obviously want Duncan gone more since he's a stronger competitor. So this leads to another tiebreaker. Again, I can't really tell what the tiebreaker is. Theoretically, I should do 2 other paths with Cody or Duncan, but for the sake of this path, I'm going to say Duncan won the tiebreaker. To be honest, Duncan probably would win any tiebreaker of Cody, and I can sum up the way that Cody winning would go in about a couple sentences. It'd be more interesting to talk about if Duncan won the tiebreaker. This aftermath kind of matters since it's mentioned in the finale. And I mean, it doesn't really matter because we know with finales that there's alternate winners and I make endings for both winners, so it really doesn't matter who gets the advantage. But I still think it's interesting to talk about this challenge, and when it comes to the groups for who supports who, a lot of things get changed that Cody isn't here anymore. Because now we have 3 finalists that all generally aren't that liked, but I also think the views get skewed a lot. Someone like Harold would actually probably lean Heather more than he would lean Duncan or Alejandro, since he dislikes Alejandro and Duncan more. And there's a lot of cases of that where there are certain characters now that just because they hate the other 2 characters more, they lean towards someone. And this is how I view the groups getting split. For Duncan, he would have Justin and Beth since his time in action, he kind of made a somewhat friendship with them. Gwen, Lashana, Noah, and Owen. Gwen, Lashana obviously like him. Owen obviously likes him, and then Noah just hates Heather and Alejandro, so he would lean Duncan. Heather would have Trent, Harold, Eva, Sierra, Blaineley, and DJ. She'd have Trent and Harold because they both don't like Duncan and they obviously wouldn't support what Alejandro's doing. Eva's kind of a tough one, but I imagine that Eva would like that Heather's a girl and that she'd kind of appreciate how hard Heather's been working. Blaineley kind of just gets thrown on Heather's side, so she's still there. Sierra would feel bad that she was so against Heather because she realizes when she gets eliminated that Alejandro edited the photo and the photo wasn't real, so she feels bad for treating Heather so poorly. And DJ in general just, I don't know, maybe he could lean Duncan, I could see that, but I really don't think DJ would support Duncan cheating on Courtney, so I imagine he would lean Heather. Then Alejandro's group is actually the exact same with Katie, Sadie, Courtney, Lindsay, and Tyler. Obviously, there's the other people I'm leaving out that are contestants not getting the votes here. Jeff and Bridget are hosts, they wouldn't choose sides. Cody and Ezekiel are still at the plane, so they wouldn't be at the aftermath. I don't remember if there's a reason, because I didn't watch the entire season for this What If, since I only came in at the Chinese fake out. But Izzy wasn't at this aftermath, and I don't remember if there's a reason, so I decided to not put her here just because I'm assuming there's a reason she wasn't there. These are the people I imagine volunteering for the groups. I imagine Harold would volunteer for Heather since Harold kind of just seemed like he wanted to compete in the challenge since he's, honorable guy. He likes competing. Courtney would still volunteer for Alejandro since there's no reason that would have to change. And then Gren would volunteer for Duncan since, she wants to help him because they are dating. When it comes to the animals, I imagine Harold would still choose a Doberman for Heather, like Blaineley chose for her, because I think Doberman just kind of fits Heather pretty well. Courtney's still here and she's still competing for Alejandro, so she still chooses a Jaguar. And when it comes to Gwen, it's pretty tough to tell what she would choose with Duncan. Well, I decided to go with Raccoon, because I think Raccoon kind of actually fits Duncan pretty well when you think about it. They're kind of clever, they're kind of smart, they're pretty scrappy. Displayed on screen now is the entire list of animals that were there on the chalkboard, so if you disagree with me looking at any of these other animals and you think that they fit Duncan better, then you're allowed to think that, but I don't know. It's kind of tough to assess what animal someone is. It's not really that easy. There's a lot of interpretive meaning that has to be applied there, so I just went with Raccoon. It doesn't even really matter. I'm just gonna move on. Obviously, since Harold and Courtney are still here, they do about the same. When it comes to Gwen, I don't really think she'd be that good at surfing. I don't know, she doesn't seem like a water person, and she's not really super competitive, so she wouldn't really have the same edge to do as well. Harold would have the same thing happen where Ember goes inside his shorts, which causes him to send his flower necklace right in front of his animal. This time, since it isn't a deer, the Doberman wouldn't eat the flower necklace, but it would make it a lot harder for Harold to get it onto the Doberman, since now he has to get into the vicinity of the aggressive Doberman to grab the flower necklace off the ground and then get it on his neck. So this would slow down Harold a considerable amount. Now, it's kind of bullshit to say this, but it just happens, and I don't have a reason to believe it wouldn't happen, but Courtney just gets extremely lucky when she flies off her surfboard, and the flower necklace just somehow ends up on the Jaguar when she's flying, so kind of bullshit, but there's nothing I really have to say why it wouldn't happen again. Courtney would win that, meaning she'd get first place prize. And Gwen would come a bit behind the pack, but because she has to get her thing on a Raccoon, which is pretty simple, she can just put that on. Meaning Alejandro gets first place, which was a wheelbarrow, Duncan gets second place prize, which is a baby cart, and Heather again gets nothing. Now back to the actual competition. Beginning of this episode, obviously the entire challenge is based off the fact that Sierra blew up the plane because they had to travel to the next location without the plane. I could not actually interpret what the challenge would be without that happening. Logically, Chris would just take them, I guess, to Hawaii and then they do a mini challenge there. That is like so out of left field for me to assume that's what's going to happen, because then I have to assume what the challenge would be and then I have to assume who would be good at that challenge. So what I'm going to say is that this time Chris would fly the plane out of Drumheller, leaving the contestants behind, and he would still have the challenge, and the challenge would still be for them to get to Hawaii. This time Chris just flies the plane away, leaving Alejandro, Duncan, and Heather behind. Chris would take Cody on the plane though, since it's a bit unnecessary to keep Cody there because he's not competing, so it just doesn't really make sense. Since Heather and Alejandro are still here, and we obviously know what ways they go, they'd go the same directions, and Duncan would travel with Alejandro since they're kind of planning to get rid of Heather. And Duncan's pretty mad at Heather for breaking her deal with him. Duncan would applaud Alejandro for his clever idea to ride in the truck, and when Alejandro falls into the box when Alejandro's in the truck, the Sasquatch kisses him, and then that causes Alejandro to be repulsed and fall backwards into a box. and he stays inside that box for the entire duration until they get onto the train. So he actually doesn't have like any option to leave the truck or like check what's happening since he's in a box. But now that Duncan's here, he would just, get him out of the box. But they wouldn't leave the truck or anything like that. They just kind of look out and notice they are going on a train. Alejandro and Heather would still fight on the train like they do originally with the hail and the dancing and the song. But Duncan, realizing that they're pretty preoccupied with each other since they're both, really obsessed with hating each other, Duncan would take this opportunity to make his way near the front of the train, and then he would take out the pins connecting the front of the train to the back half of the train where Heather and Alejandro are. I see Duncan doing this since he'd obviously realized that it would put Alejandro and Heather really far behind, and we've seen in the show that Duncan's not really afraid to commit crimes. I mean, he's a delinquent, so he wouldn't really care about the consequences of doing that. But obviously, Heather and Alejandro are still fighting, and Heather knocks Alejandro off the train before this even happens with Duncan, and then Duncan does it 5 minutes later or something. But when Heather knocks Alejandro off the train originally, she knocks him off right where horses are, and then Alejandro rides those horses. So once Heather realizes that the train stops and she sees Duncan far ahead and she's mad, Alejandro is just about now catching up to the train. So Heather takes this as an opportunity to jump off the train on top of the horse so she can get back in the competition. And when it comes to who would get there first, I really don't know. It's tough for me because it's actually shown in the original that the horses are a lot faster than the train. They're able to catch up to the train and then pass the train. But now that Duncan has disconnected a considerable amount of weight from the train, I imagine the train would probably go a lot faster. It's obviously also a question of would Duncan get stopped by 40s or things like that, but that's going a bit too far too. So I'm just going to say that they both get there roughly the same time, with Duncan having a slight lead. When it comes to the boat race, it's kind of hard to tell who would get the advantage ahead of people, because originally everybody's pretty close, and the only time that changes is once Cody starts a fight with Alejandro. That allows Heather time to make up ground, but Cody isn't here. We just saw with Duncan that he's obviously willing to be manipulative, he's willing to play the game hard, and I think he'd still be pretty mad at Heather for breaking the deal. So he'd take this as an opportunity to start a swordfish fight with Heather like Cody did with Alejandro originally. Heather would get really annoyed at Duncan trying to fight her, and then eventually she'd take him up on his offer, and Duncan would intentionally lose the fight, so that way Heather gets distracted because now she'd be cocky that she just won, and she wouldn't notice her boat running into an explosive, and it get launched in the air just like Alejandro's boat does. But just like the original two, Heather would crash into Duncan's boat. Duncan and Heather would now be part of the tiebreaker in the next episode. And technically there's hundreds of options what this tiebreaker could have been, because when Heather goes to select the tiebreaker, there are all these golf balls that are hitting her, and every single one of them presumably has different tiebreakers. And now Alejandro's going in there, so if we're being fully realistic, he choose a different one, but there's no way I can know what it is. So it's just the same tiebreaker, because fuck that. There's no way I can actually tell what it would have been. It could actually be anything. And at this point, Chris actually mentions before the tiebreaker happens about the eliminated contestants playing a huge role in the winner. Again, they'd assume it's a vote, and Alejandro would probably assume that he could beat Heather in a vote easier than he could beat Duncan in a vote. So Alejandro would go out of his way to sabotage Duncan in the tiebreaker, maybe just doing the same thing Heather does. Oh no, Gwen's on shore, something happened. Duncan's probably not that dumb, but even then, there's nothing stopping Alejandro from helping Heather during the challenge. So with Alejandro's help, Duncan gets eliminated, meaning our finale is the same. When it comes to helpers, Alejandro would obviously still choose Courtney and Lindsay, since there's no reason for any of that to change. Heather's kind of a bit more tough now, since I don't really imagine Cody needing to opt up like he does in the original, because he wasn't just beaten by Alejandro, really care as much, but I still think he'd volunteer to be Heather's helper, since in this version they get along a lot better now. And with Cody, I imagine Sierra would also volunteer to help with Heather. Again, same thing I mentioned in the aftermath, Sierra feels a bit bad for being so aggressive with Heather when she now realizes it wasn't Heather's fault at all. When it comes to the beginning part before the finale where they have to make the pineapple sacrifices, I considered if Sierra being Heather's helper would actually give Heather the win, because Sierra has been shown in World Tour to be very crafty when it comes to weaving a basket out of grass, making braids, basically just making things really easily. And I imagine she'd be good at making things. However, Sierra is pretty preoccupied at this point since she's just met back with Cody. There's a lot of tension here since, Cody feels bad for voting out Sierra. Sierra feels bad for going off at Cody and Heather. So they're just kind of in an awkward place. So they're kind of too focused on that. So Alejandro would still win the first beginning part of making the pineapple sacrifices. Doesn't really matter. It's like a 10-second head start. Doesn't change anything really. And from here, everything in the finale in the original plays out the same. The only difference here is that the subplot with Cody and Sierra is still very much here. And while they are cutting ropes, Cody and Sierra would kind of apologize to each other. Cody would say he kind of feels bad for what he did to Sierra, since it seemed that he kind of feels bad for what happened to Sierra originally. And obviously he wouldn't have the scene now of Sierra remembering his birthday, which was a big part of why Cody forgave her. But I still do think Cody would kind of feel bad, considering he does kind of like Sierra. Sierra's just... she's crazy. And Sierra would apologize for being really protective and, insane. Heather would yell at them to start helping her in the challenge since, she's still competing for $1 million. And Sierra would get past Alejandro's helpers, but then accidentally cut the rope that makes a cage fall on top of Heather, originally what Cody did. And then from there, everything else plays out the same. Heather still tricks Alejandro and kicks him in the balls and knocks him down the volcano. And then you have your alternate winners based on the same thing, which was kind of dumb with Heather throwing the wrong pineapple sacrifice, but whatever. Now let's go down the path if Blaineley won the tiebreaker. First things first is that when Blaineley gets eliminated, she discloses that Ezekiel is still on the plane. But now that she wasn't eliminated, that wouldn't be disclosed. And just like in the Courtney one, Chris finds out that Chef and Blaineley were cheating. Again, I don't know how he figures this out. There was nothing where this was ever said. But as punishment for Blaineley cheating, I imagine Chris would have the same thing where Blaineley would just have to wear a really big, hefty jacket in Africa. Sierra and Cody would still be in first class because Sierra won and brought Cody. Heather, Duncan, and Alejandro would still kind of have the same thing in loser class. Duncan would make fun of Alejandro and Heather for denying that they like each other so much. Blaineley would look at these three, and it was seen in Chinese fake out that Blaineley was really desperate to get an alliance. She was on the intercom, she was talking to everybody, she was really trying hard to have somebody work with her. And I think Blaineley could pretty easily see that these three are all very strategic players, and they're not really the best to work with, because she can't really manipulate them as easily. And since they are all working on each other right now, and none of them have even started really working on Cody or Sierra, so Sierra would definitely see that as an in. So during this challenge, she would want to try and build a bond with Sierra and Cody. When it comes to the first part of the challenge's gourds, everything would stay relatively same. The Heather would still come first, Alejandro would still break his, Sierra and Cody wouldn't be able to break a gourd, and Duncan would break his with a bat. And then Blaineley, I imagine, would do just as bad as Sierra, especially now since she's competing in the hefty jacket, so she's sweating a lot and she's hard to focus. So Blaineley would get the same thing that Sierra and Cody got, which was just one trank ball each and then nothing to launch it with. And now this is where Ezekiel not being revealed that he was on the plane matters now, because the entire challenge was hunting down Ezekiel. But since nobody knows that Ezekiel was on the plane except for Blaineley, I'm assuming that Chris would probably just use something like a lion, a big deadly animal. Still would kind of fit the same idea, and since they're in Africa, it fits. Now it's just going to be a lion in a cage, and they have to find the lion, and maybe there's like a Chris stamp on its body, so that way they can know that this is a specific lion they have to get. Same things with Alejandro and Duncan and Heather happen. They say they should go in a group. Heather doesn't want to work in a group, but while they're in a group huddle, Alejandro steals Heather's trank balls. Blaineley would work with Sierra and Cody. She'd be a bit weirded out by Sierra and a bit worried for Cody, since it's a really... in this episode, it's a pretty messed up situation where Sierra is basically making Cody sick and then using... it's messed up. Anyway, Blaineley would hang out with them, and even though she obviously thinks Sierra is a freak, she would try her best to be friendly to them to try and get on their good side. Heather would still have this thing where she runs into the lion. She doesn't have trank balls since Alejandro stole them, so she'd still run away. Sierra gets Cody stuck in a tree, and Blaineley would still be there, and then Heather would run into them while Cody's still in the tree. Now Heather tries to plead for a bit that Sierra should help Heather, go find Zeke. And now that Blaineley's here, Blaineley would also tell Sierra that she should go do it, and that Blaineley can get Cody. Blaineley would want to do this, and since she'd want to save Cody to try and get good points with both Cody and Sierra. And originally Cody notices tracks of Zeke, and he points it out to Heather, so Heather knows the direction to go Sierra, so Heather would still do that with Sierra, and Sierra would actually go this time since she knows now that Blaineley can help Cody. Now, there's a lot of things that go odd here. Originally what happens is that the monkey takes Cody, and then Sierra and Heather follow the monkey, which ends up getting them to Alejandro and Duncan. Now that Heather and Sierra follow the tracks, and Blaineley would have to follow Cody since she's trying to save Cody, she would end up going that direction. Also, because Alejandro and Duncan go into quicksand, and Zeke isn't here, and they obviously couldn't get help from a lion, so they'd just be in quicksand. And by the time Blaineley, passes them, they'd be fairly deep, maybe like upper torso and neck and head. Both ask for Blaineley's help, and Blaineley says she will help them if they both agree to not vote for her this round. And since they're both pretty low in quicksand, they would agree to these terms. Heifer and Sierra would follow the tracks that Cody points out, but Heifer had all her trank balls stolen from her, and Sierra only has one. I don't imagine that they'd actually have the best chance of catching the lion, because they'd have to find the lion, be 100% sure, and then shoot it. But also Sierra doesn't even have a slingshot, so she couldn't even shoot it at the lion. Again, odds are very low here, so I'm very confident in saying that neither of them would catch the lion. Blaineley would eventually find Cody with protective monkeys, and even though Blaineley isn't Sierra when it comes to crazy amount of strength to help with Cody, it was still seen in the last episode that she had karate lessons with one of her trainers that she used on Heather. And I don't know if that's really enough to beat the monkeys, but also Blaineley's been wearing the jacket all day and she's very sweaty. I imagine the monkeys probably wouldn't want to touch her, so I do think Blaineley could beat the monkeys with her karate and just how disgusting her body would be from sweating all day. After Blaineley saves Cody, she makes a deal with him, saying, I'll help you with Sierra if we work together in an alliance and you vote with me. And Cody would obviously want all the help he can give to Sierra's situation since it's getting really out of hand. So he'd agree to these terms, even though he knows that Blaineley isn't the most trustworthy person. He just wants any help he can with Sierra. Now, Alejandro is a bit of a goofy character because I don't know what the hell his motives are. In World Tour, both Heather and Alejandro, I swear, it's like every episode they're flipping a quarter and then deciding that quarter is their allegiance. I don't know if Alejandro would still have the same plan to get rid of Duncan because I don't even know what started that. I don't know at what point Alejandro decided that Duncan was a threat to his game, or at what point he decided that Duncan was a bigger threat to his game than Heather. Would Alejandro even want an alliance with Heather now since he isn't with Heather? He's traveling with Duncan. Heather and Sierra are traveling somewhere else, so he's not even in the vicinity of Heather. Again, now it's like, did he get rid of Duncan originally because he had the alliance with Heather, so he thought it was going to work out? In which case he wouldn't do with Duncan, so it's like, I don't know what set off his reasoning to decide I don't want to work with Duncan anymore, because in Alejandro's mind, Duncan was pretty loyal to him most of the time, so there was no point to get rid of him the way he did. So it's confusing. But given the circumstances that, these two groups aren't near each other anymore, Alejandro might be a bit worried that they might win the challenge. So I guess he'd do the same thing to Duncan. Since I can't tell exactly why he even wanted to do it, maybe Duncan's too big of a threat and he has to get rid of him, which is kind of a shit reason, but I'm just going to say that he'd still push Duncan in the bloodberry bush and then have a lion attack him this time, except he just shoot the lion before he does any damage to Duncan. So Alejandro would still win immunity this time around with Duncan being upset at him. However, Heather and Alejandro could still work out a deal. They just do it on the plane now, where they talk about on the plane, they say, no, I want to beat you in the finale, so we're going to work together to get the finale. When it comes to the vote, I imagine Blaineley leans pretty heavily towards Heather, since Blaineley knows that Alejandro and Heather both like each other, they just won't admit it. So she thinks it's really dangerous to have two competitors that are as smart and strong as them liking each other. So she would want Heather out, also since the cheating in the last episode was called out by Heather, like her cheating with Chef. So she'd still be a bit mad at Heather for that. She could very easily convince Sierra to go along with this plan, since, again, I mentioned this in the Courtney one, but this vote is so confusing for so many reasons. It is heavily kind of assumed that Sierra was the one who voted for Heather. And with that assumption that a lot of people agree with, Sierra voting Heather originally, there's no reason she wouldn't vote Heather now with Blaineley telling her to vote Heather, so Sierra could easily go that way. And I imagine Blaineley would also try to recruit Cody, but I do think Cody would be a bit more hesitant about this. Heather helped him during the last couple challenges, and he would just want Sierra gone. He doesn't want to have Sierra in the game anymore. Cody would kind of think when Blaineley made that deal to him, saying that she'd help him deal with Sierra, he thought she meant that they'd vote out Sierra. But obviously Blaineley wouldn't want to do that since that's her alliance. So Cody would kind of be, upset and annoyed, disgruntled about the situation because he thought it was different, and he wouldn't really want to get rid of Heather. Also, Duncan is still in the game, and Duncan and Cody do not get along, and I don't think Cody would really want to keep Duncan either. So it's in general, Cody just had a lot of other options that he wants gone more than Heather. Heather and Alejandro would still have their alliance that they have with the original, and originally they vote for Duncan because they view him as a big threat. So I'd imagine they'd still do him, because I don't think they'd think Blaineley's a bigger threat than Duncan, because realistically she isn't. So they'd both still vote for Duncan, and now that there's 2 votes on Duncan, 2 votes on Heather, Heather would realize that they only have 2 votes on Duncan, and that if these 4 were to vote together, which is unlikely, but if they did, Heather would be in trouble because Al has immunity. So she would go and talk to Cody and kind of beg him to vote for Duncan, because she really needs Duncan to go. Duncan would be a lot more of a appealing option to him, since he really doesn't like Duncan. Would agree, and it would be a 3-1. It'd be a 3-2-1 vote. Honestly, Duncan probably still voting Alejandro like he does in the original. Stupid vote, whatever, who cares. Alejandro winning the challenge would see that Cody voted with them, and he'd take him to first class to start working on him. This would obviously upset Heather like it does in the original, because Heather didn't like that she didn't get taken to first class. Blaineley would be really mad at Cody for betraying her. And Sierra would also be sad, but she wouldn't be mad because she can't be mad at Cody. Same things with Alejandro and Cody happen in first class. Cody's very thankful for Alejandro protecting him from Sierra, and he likes candy, so, they get along well. And Sierra and Heather originally have a scene in the back where Sierra is trying to ask about how to fix her problems with Cody, and Heather just says you need to focus on the girls in your life because boys come and go. And now that Blaineley's here, I imagine Blaineley could also back up Heather with this, and they'd kind of, tease an idea of an all-girls alliance, but Sierra's pretty hesitant about this, and she doesn't want to vote out Cody. She doesn't want to work against Cody. But, Heather and Blaineley seem somewhat on board. When it comes to the challenge, Heather, Blaineley, and Sierra somewhat working together at this point. Sierra would leave Heather, Blaineley, and herself a basket. Cody would have Alejandro's basket, and Alejandro obviously just knows how to juggle eggs. So everyone at this point would have the capabilities to compete in the challenge a fair amount. And now that Sierra, Heather, and Blaineley are traveling together, when Sierra's egg hatches, since Heather's still here, I'm just going to assume that it imprints on Heather, since I don't really know how Blaineley being there would change the fact that it would imprint on Heather. I mean, unless Blaineley was in the face of the egg, but I imagine Blaineley would be like, ew, the egg's hatching. She's kind of artificial. And was like, oh, that's gross, and she'd want to get away from it. So the baby bird would still imprint on Heather, and again, as I said in the Courtney timeline, this challenge doesn't really matter when it comes to first at the beginning. It's really just whoever this bird imprints on, they have the best chance of winning, because the mama condor will swoop down and grab the baby and not the person, which gives the person enough time to then put the eggs in the basket. So Heather would win this challenge. And this is again where the voting motives get pretty confusing. Heather, you'd think, is working with Sierra and Blaineley since they just had that deal, but in the original, Heather actually votes for Sierra despite the fact that she's working on Sierra the entire time. And she says this because Sierra is insane, and she thinks that Sierra isn't a reliable ally, and she thinks that Cody's a better ally. And I don't really have a reason to believe that she wouldn't think that. Cody's still here, so she could still think that Cody would be a good ally for her, and Sierra's just kind of a liability. Also, she sees that if she got rid of Sierra and Cody wouldn't work with Heather, she can still fall back on Blaineley, since Blaineley wouldn't have any other options. She could still work with Blaineley to at least do a tie. Or, if they vote out Alejandro or something, then, Sierra and Cody are attached to the hips, and then Blaineley could turn on Heather because, she would want to go to the end of Cody or Sierra since they're easier to beat. So Heather would want Sierra gone, just for ally reasons, and also just it makes more sense for her game. And given the fact that the entire reason Heather voted out Sierra was that she thought Cody was a better ally, I think it's pretty safe to assume she'd take Cody to first class. And not that this really matters, but this means that Cody's been to first class 3 times in a row. He's a spoiled boy. Heather starts working with Cody to try and get him to vote out Alejandro next round, but Cody's pretty hesitant since in this universe they actually aren't the best of friends. They're not friends, they're just kind of in a middle ground. They didn't bond nearly as much as they did in the Courtney Path. Kind of be more indebted to Alejandro at this point, since Alejandro helped him with Sierra, he helped him with Candy. Also, Cody kind of feels a little bit mistreated by Heather, considering that the only reason Heather is still here is because Cody voted with her, and Heather hasn't even thanked him for that or anything. So Cody's starting to feel a little bit mistreated by Heather and is pretty hesitant when she says that. When it comes to loser class, I think Alejandro could realize at this point that Heather could be working with Cody and that they could have an alliance, so Alejandro wouldn't think it's the worst idea to work with Blaineley. Blaineley at this point doesn't really have many options. Cody's kind of being played fiddle between Heather and Alejandro, so Blaine doesn't have really any strong allies. So Blaineley would like the prospect of having more options to be able to go to a finale. So she'd take Alejandro up on his deal, but obviously she isn't really planning to uphold her end of protecting Alejandro. She's shifty like that. But she's all for willing to take that deal, fake be in alliance with Alejandro. When it comes to the challenge, again, Alejandro, Cody, and Heather are here, so they make the same things. It's kind of difficult to tell what Blaineley would make exactly, but I imagine it'd just be like a real, sparkly, shiny thing. And I think Heather's honest vote would resonate with that. Since the reason she voted for Sierra's in the original was that glitter glue, she liked it. So I imagine she'd also kind of like a more stylish, poppy thing as opposed to a shit dinosaur and a real dinosaur. And with Alejandro, again, kind of leaning here because the other two options aren't really anything he'd like. He wouldn't like Heather's Chris dinosaur since he hates Chris, and he doesn't really like a shit dinosaur. So Blaineley kind of wins not from being something that Alejandro likes so much, mainly just that the competition wasn't that great. It's shown in the original that Cody was really impressed by Alejandro's real dinosaur, so I imagine his honest vote would be for Alejandro. And when it comes to Blaineley's honest vote, I don't know. I think she'd actually lean towards the Chris dinosaur because she kind of likes the style of it, and even though she doesn't like Chris, she can respect a dinosaur that has those like host-like qualities and has that sort of style. This means that Blaineley gets 2 votes, Alejandro gets 1 vote, Heather gets 1 vote, and Cody gets no votes. Blaineley gets the drill, Heather and Alejandro get pickaxes, and Cody gets his hands. I imagine Blaineley would win this challenge since the drill is really just an overpowered advantage to get since it's shown to just get the barrels up in like seconds. So all she needs to do is really find a barrel and then she can just get it. I imagine she could win the challenge pretty easily, especially since Cody has nothing and Alejandro and Heather would still have the same thing they had with Heather getting trapped underneath a boulder and then Alejandro helping her in exchange that they go to the end together. Alejandro would tell Heather that they can both vote for Cody since Blaineley won immunity. So Alejandro votes Cody. Cody obviously votes Alejandro. And Blaineley, since she doesn't care about a word at all, would vote for Alejandro since she thinks that he is a bigger threat. Just like the original, Heather doesn't have a reason to go through with this vote, and she doesn't go through with this vote since she knows that Al is a big threat. So she would vote for Alejandro too, causing a 3-1 vote with Alejandro going home. And this aftermath gets really interesting because I do not think anybody, I mean anyone, would root for Blaineley or Heather. Rooting would be completely Cody. I don't think there's a single person that dislikes Cody enough to not choose him. And Heather and Blaineley honestly might be 2 of the most disliked people in the entire show. But obviously Bridget and Jeff still need there to be volunteers for Heather and Blaineley. So they say that production might have thought this would have happened with Heather and Blaineley. So they have a deal. Whoever volunteers for Blaineley or Heather, if Heather or Blaineley wins the actual, if they win the $1 million, they will get $10,000 courtesy of production if the person that they are helping wins. And this would obviously turn some eyes. I mean, first of all, real quick, Cody would get Sierra as a helper. I mean, they didn't end on the greatest terms, but it wasn't like that bad anymore since it wasn't Sierra being really mad or anything like that. And then I imagine with the $10,000 deal being put out for Blaineley and Heather, Justin would take that deal up for Blaineley, and DJ would take up that deal for Heather. Justin would take it up for Blaineley since Justin is kind of in that sphere of liking popularity and things like that, so we think it'd be cool. So we'd kind of like to help another vainful person. And also Justin would obviously just want the money. And same kind of idea with DJ. DJ would kind of feel bad for Heather that she doesn't have anybody. And also Heather just hasn't been that bad to him this season. She's actually been kind of nice helping him through the time when he was on Team Victory alone. Also, it was shown in the special leading into World Tour that DJ and his mom lost their house and had to live in the van. So DJ could obviously use the money. So he'd really want a chance at winning the money. Just like in the Courtney Path, I have difficulty choosing animals for people because it's a weird thing. I imagine that Justin would choose a bear for Blaineley since Justin's been on all the aftermaths of Blaineley and he kind of knows, what she's like. She seems really aggressive. She seems a bit slobbish, mean, so he thinks that a bear fits her pretty well. I think DJ would probably just choose a Doberman for Heather. Again, I didn't really think any of the other animals matched Heather, and I don't think DJ would think any of the other animals matched Heather. Doberman's just a good mix for Heather since it comes off as a really aggressive dog, just like Heather. And Sierra would probably still choose a deer just like Harold, because she thinks Cody's cute, deer cute, Cody cute. it makes sense. DJ would be upset when he hears the challenge involves the animals they chose since he's afraid that he's gonna hurt the Doberman. But Jeff reassures him and says, nah, it's probably fine. You'll be okay. And this helps DJ out so he feels a little bit better, but still kind of is reluctantly agreeing since he has a bad feeling it's gonna happen. Now, I don't really actually know how everybody here would do with surfing since I haven't really seen any of them surf. Sierra and Justin would be mostly fine since I don't have a reason to believe they'd be bad. But we do see with DJ that he is not a good swimmer, and it's safe to assume that if he's not a good swimmer, he probably doesn't go surfing. But it was seen in the original that Owen was able to make up a lot of time from being behind because of his weight, giving him more momentum. Obviously, DJ isn't Owen weight, but he still is a pretty hefty guy. He'd be somewhat close to Sierra and Justin, just like behind them a bit. Originally, Harold is up in the front, and when he flies off the little ledge, an ember from the volcano falls into his shorts, and that causes him to panic and freak out. But now that Sierra's in the front, one, I don't think she'd be wearing trunks. I don't remember what her bathing suit's like, but I'm pretty sure it was a lot tighter than trunks, so no embers could probably go in there. And even if they did, Sierra is an unhinged person. I don't think she'd care enough about the pain from that fire versus helping Cody. She is that crazy. And she'd be able to hold onto her flower necklace until she gets to the deer and puts it on the deer. Justin would come up a bit behind Sierra, and he'd have to get the flower necklace on a bear, which is kind of hard, but it was seen in the first season that Justin was able to like casually seduce dangerous animals like sharks and stuff. So I imagine he could also do it with a bear pretty easily. So he just seduced the bear and then put the flower necklace on him. DJ would come up behind and he would fly off the surfboard and land right on the Doberman's platform. And as the Doberman starts to approach him, DJ would beg the Doberman to get away from him since he doesn't want to hurt the Doberman because the animal curse, he's afraid he's going to hurt him. But the Doberman just ends up getting really close to DJ's face and starts licking him, kind of showing DJ like, hey, maybe I'm not cursed after all, as he pets the Doberman.
I'm aware that's not accurate, but I'm kind of a DJ stan, and him hurting animals was pretty cruel, so I decided to give him that. If you want to be really accurate, what would probably actually happen is that he'd fly off the surfboard and the surfboard would hit the Doberman in the face and it'd hurt the dog. But did you want to hurt the dog? If you did, then you're a sick human being.
This means that Cody would get the first place prize, which is a wheelbarrow. Blaineley would get the second place prize, which was a baby carriage. And Heather again would get the last place prize, which is nothing. Oh, wait, I gotta add this. Alright. I don't really feel like having to try and find the episode name, so I'm just going to call it, Running Challenge. Again, Sierra wasn't in Drumheller, so Sierra didn't blow up the plane. I already mentioned this in the Courtney Path, so if you already know what I'm about to say, just skip like 20 seconds ahead. But what I said was going to happen instead is that Chris would just fly the plane away and he would still make the competitors travel to Hawaii, since there's literally no way I can decide what actual challenge would be without assuming that. And just like I said before, Chris would take Alejandro since there's no reason for Alejandro to be there since he's not competing. Heather would go off and Cody would ask to go with her, and Heather would agree since they are both planning to go to the finale together. I imagine since Blaineley is a host of a TV show, she would kind of know about the production world and know that there's a production truck. And at this point, Blaineley would know that Heather and Cody are on the train that they're going on, since she never got trapped in the box, so she would know she's going on a train. Also, since she knows that Ezekiel is still on the plane, she would find the crate that has Ezekiel and she'd get him out. And she'd make a deal with Ezekiel that if Ezekiel can get Heather and Cody off the train to help her win the challenge, then she will split the money with Ezekiel. And since that's Ezekiel's end goal, he eagerly agrees with the plan. Feral Ezekiel, I could imagine throwing Cody off the train pretty handily. I imagine he'd kind of throw him around the same area where Alejandro gets thrown off originally, which was near the horses. And it's also actually seen in the original too that Zeke throws Heather off the train. So again, also pretty safe to assume that Ezekiel could throw Heather off the train. Once Heather's thrown off, she watches as the train leaves, feeling defeated and upset that she's losing and she can't do anything about it. But Cody, who was dropped off by the horses earlier, is able to get the horses to go, and he stops right as he meets Heather on the floor defeated and just tells Heather to get on the horse. Heather is really surprised by this since they don't really have that strong of a bond, and she kind of asks why Cody would do this, in which turn Cody just says shut up and get on the horse. Since he doesn't really feel the need to explain himself, he just wants to get on the challenge. And Heather smiles and gets on the horse as they try to quickly catch up to Blaineley. Again, same sort of dilemma I had with the Courtney Path. If you didn't watch that part and you're just skipping the Blaineley Path, I'll just explain it really quickly. I couldn't really tell which would get there quicker, the train or the horses, because the horses in the canon are quicker than the train. Cody would obviously take longer to get the horses going than Alejandro would, since Cody's not good with horses. He just, he landed near the horses and he had enough time, so he figured it out. And also he had to take a stop to talk to Heather. So both those events slowed them down. So I imagine since those slowed them down a bit, they'd all get to the boats around the same time. When it comes to the boats, Cody obviously has a swordfish fight he has with Alejandro, which his plan is to trick Alejandro into running to an explosive, so that he can obviously get a lead. And he'd probably do that plan again, except this time with Blaineley. And, obviously he'd sword fight, he'd purposely lose so that Blaineley doesn't focus, and then Blaineley runs to the sing. And then as they go up together, but I actually imagine that Heather would cross, and then Cody would cross before Blaineley crashes into him. Because in the original, Sierra is the one driving Cody's boat, and I don't know why she decides to stop, but she just does. And I imagine Cody, now that he's kind of more challenge-oriented and he wants to win, I don't think he'd make the stupid mistake of stopping his boat, slowing it down as he's getting near the end. So Cody would just get to shore first, and Blaineley would end up getting launched into the air, and then her boat would hit the shore, just because it's funny and I want to do it. This makes our finale Heather versus Cody. Let me delete these. We wouldn't actually have the first half of the episode being the tiebreaker now, so we just get straight into the helper part. Cody would choose Sierra since he knows that Sierra would help her a lot. And Harold, even though he didn't get to compete in the Aftermath challenge, is still a heavy Cody supporter. So Cody would take that offer, and he'd also choose Harold. And again, Heather wouldn't really have almost any options at all, since everyone is pro Cody at this point. But given that there was obviously romance between Heather and Alejandro, Heather would pick him and offer him $100,000 of the prize money if she wins. And obviously that would pique Alejandro's interest, so he'd agree. And DJ, being nice, would feel bad for Heather that she doesn't have anybody, standing up to help him. And again, Heather's been pretty nice this season. And also the $10,000 he gets from production if Heather wins is a good incentive too. So DJ volunteers for Heather. When it comes to the mini challenge of making the pineapple sacrifice, I think Alejandro, being a great challenge competitor and DJ's big hands allowing him to carry more wood for the challenge, I do think they could win it pretty easily. And plus, same sort of thing I said with the Courtney Path, Sierra would be still a bit upset at Cody and not fully 100% in the challenge. So Heather would actually win the first part of the challenge, but it doesn't really matter, it's a 10-second lead, so... And Cody still actually gets the wheelbarrow from the Aftermath, and Heather has nothing. But this actually wouldn't affect things too much, since it was shown in the original that Heather was surprisingly able to keep up with Alejandro really well, considering the fact that she was carrying a massive thing and she was going against Alejandro, who's a pretty quick guy. So I don't think she'd have much trouble keeping up with Cody, considering that Cody's not as fast as Alejandro, and that Heather would now have to carry a smaller sacrifice that's Cody-sized. So I imagine they'd actually be kind of tied until they get to the stepping stones. But Sierra, being the crazy person she is and being as agile as she is, she'd be able to sneak past them and cut the rope that gets Heather caught in the cage that she does originally. And this leads to the winning ending for Cody, where Heather gets trapped in the cage, and then Cody has enough time to get to the top of the volcano and throw his pineapple sacrifice in. Leads to everybody being happy and cheering for Cody. And Cody celebrates with Sierra being the underdog, with Sierra hugging him tightly. But for the Heather winning ending, it actually still would be the same with Heather getting the cage falling on top of her. But this time, as she's in the cage, she's kind of upset. She kind of feels like giving up. She kind of feels bad too that nobody wanted to help her and that everybody wants Cody to win, so she should just let Cody have this one. But Alejandro would get kind of mad at her, saying that she deserves it more than anybody and that she's worked too hard to give up right now. And this would kind of resonate with Heather a bit, realizing that she has worked really hard and that she deserves it for all her hard work. So she'd do the same thing she does in the original. She'd push the cage over and she'd quickly run to try and catch up with Cody. Heather is able to catch up to Cody, but she's panting a lot, and Cody kind of feels bad watching this, but he doesn't stop the brakes, he still keeps going. Heather is still able to barely inch out Cody and get her sacrifice in first. There's kind of a awkward pause once Heather throws it in, since nobody really wanted her to win. That is until Cody stands up and congratulates her on winning. And this causes everybody else to kind of admit that Heather worked really hard and she deserves the win, and everybody cheers for Heather too. And ignore how happy those endings are, because Zeke still comes and ruins the finale. Look at him go. And alright, that was if Total Drama had an actual tiebreaker. I really liked doing multiple paths. I think it was kind of fun to do. It definitely stressful. It was a lot. But I would be curious to know in the comments which path you liked more. I do think they both kind of fleshed out in their own unique ways. And if you're gonna try and call me out for the Blaineley thing of eliminating her without the tiebreaker, you caught me. Because fuck you, I'm not having Blaineley in the finale. I'm not writing an alternate winning ending from Blaineley. Screw you. I can't legally let that happen. It would be a sin. I'd be
at the gates of heaven and they'd send me to hell for doing something as heinous as that.